Hello everyone, welcome to the 3ds Max software tutorial. In this video and the upcoming parts of this series, I want to introduce you to the basics and fundamentals of working with 3ds Max. So, if you're a beginner or just about to start working with 3ds Max, this tutorial can be very helpful and useful for you. Well, in the first part, we're going to take a look at the 3ds Max interface. One thing I should mention is that in different versions of this software, if you're using an older version, that's fine. Here, I'm explaining the 3ds Max 2026 interface. But if you have other versions, it doesn't really matter. The overall appearance of the software has been the same for years. And with each version, only some new options are added, and some of the previous options are optimized and improved, and their speed increases. So let's look at the different parts of the 3ds Max interface together. This top section is the menu bar. This part is called the main toolbar, which contains the most frequently used tools, tools that we need a lot during a project. They're placed here, and almost all of them have hotkeys or shortcuts, which I'll explain to you, and we'll work with them. This section is called the ribbon, which contains some more advanced tools and options that you'll need at higher levels while working on a project. These are more advanced modeling tools. This large section in the software interface is called the viewport, which forms our workspace, and whenever we want to work on a project, we're constantly engaged in this space. Of course, by pressing Alt plus W, you can turn it into 4 viewports, or by pressing Alt plus W again, you can return it to its large single view. On the right side, we have the command panel, which contains all the main commands for editing all the objects and elements that are created, whether you create a shape, a line, a light, a camera, or any of their subcategories. Whenever you create any of these objects and want to edit them, change their parameters, or apply some modifiers which allow us to have more control over our object, change its form, or make thousands of different changes to it, they're all located in this section. This section on the left, which has recently been added to 3D Max, is the Arnold Render Engine toolbar. Arnold is the default render engine installed with 3D Max. I'll explain render engines in more detail later, but for now, if you want to change your render engine, you can go to Render Setup, and here your render engine is specified. If you have installed other render engines like V-Ray, Corona, F-Storm, or any other render engine on your 3D Max, they will be added to this section. But by default, the Arnold Render Engine is installed on the 3D Max toolbar, and this toolbar here is related to the Arnold Render Engine. This section is actually our viewport layout, which allows us to change the arrangement of our viewports. For example, when I press Alt and W and my viewport splits into 4 sections, if I want, I can change it to other layouts, like making it 2 or 3 panels, depending on my preference and the project I'm working on, and we can change it to different modes. I'll also explain how to change the viewports themselves and how to navigate, and you can always return to previous states. This section is our Scene Explorer, where any object we have in the scene, if I have different objects, for example, they will be added to this list. Based on the name of the objects, we can select them, and from this section we can manage them, like hiding or unhiding, or freezing the object we want. There are other options here that I'll explain in more detail later. Down here we have tools and options related to display and animation creation. Here we have a time slider that we can use for animation purposes. On the right side we have tools for controlling our view windows, or in other words, navigation tools for moving around our workspace, like zooming, panning, or rotating inside the viewport. I'll explain all their hotkeys to you, and you'll work with those hotkeys. Here we have some coordinate boxes that show the coordinates of our objects relative to 0, 0 in 3D Max, which is the center of the 3D Max coordinate system. 0, 0, 0 for X, Y, and Z is right here. The position of our objects is shown here relative to that 0, 0, 0 point. In different tools, like if we're in the rotate tool, it shows differently. If we're in the scale tool, it shows differently. But in any case, this is our coordinate box, and I want to work with it a lot. There are also a few small options around it that I'll explain to you. This section gives us some information. This is our 3D Max information area. For example, it tells us that an object is currently selected, and the last command we performed was click, drag to select, and move object. And it gives us a lot of useful information. This section is the programming and scripting area of 3D Max, where you can code in MaxScript or Python. If you know programming, you can use this section to create various tools, plugins, or scripts. So this is the general layout of the 3D Max software. Now let's move on to introducing the different sections. To make the lesson a bit easier to follow, I might refer to different sections as we go along. For example, when I'm working on this side, I might have to explain some of the tools right then and there, so you can get results more easily and quickly. I don't want this tutorial to be too long. In these few parts where we're teaching you the basics of 3ds Max, I want you to get familiar with the 3ds Max environment quickly and easily, work with different sections, and get to know the various tools so you can start working with the software. Now I press Alt and U to return to my perspective window and maximize it. Let's move on to the menu section, and I'll explain it to you in detail. If you've created a scene and want to start working on a new file, you click on File, then New. When you select New, all the objects and elements in the scene are cleared and you have a blank file. But if you've changed your viewports, for example, let's say I change my viewports and work like this, when you click New, your viewports will stay the same. But if you want to completely reset your viewports to their original state, you should use the Reset option, which returns the file entirely to its initial state, as if you've opened a brand new 3ds Max. To save your file, you use this option here. To open a file, you use this option. If you want to import a file from other software into 3ds Max, you use the import option down here, which supports various formats from software like Revit, AutoCAD, SketchUp, and many other formats. You can import files like FBX, which is a common format among modeling software and Autodesk products. If you want to export a file from 3ds Max to other software, you should use the export option, which again allows 3ds Max to output in these formats. For example, if you need to take your file into Lumion, Unreal Engine, or any other software that supports these formats, you can choose the appropriate format and export it. There's also an option called Merge in the import section. Merge is used to bring 3ds Max files into your current 3ds Max project. Import is for files from other software, meaning if you've worked in another software and want to bring that file into 3ds Max, you use import. Merge is specifically for 3ds Max files. For example, if you want to bring a ready-made object or scene into your current project, you should use the Merge option from the import menu. Right now, we only use Merge for this specific format. We only import .max files, and the 3ds Max files that we save are saved in the .max format. For now, we do not need to use the other sections. I'll explain the rest to you later. This was a brief introduction to the file section. It has various menus, and you could say that almost all the options in 3ds Max are very systematically organized within these menus, which we'll go through step by step. Let's move on to the command panel, the panel for commands. Here we have two very important tabs, the Create tab and the Modify tab. In the Create tab, we have the objects we need to build a space, a 3D world, or a project we want to work on. Whether it's an architectural project, building a car body, or simulating a product, it doesn't matter. Whatever project we're working on, anything we need for that project, usually a project is made up of volumes, lines, lights, cameras, and some other objects that are available in this section. We can select whatever we want to create from here. Geometry refers to volumes, and it has various options. I'll explain some of them and you can check out the rest yourself, but the main one is the standard primitives. which gives us the basic shapes. By modifying and transforming these shapes, we can get to the form we need. For example, I can start from a box and end up with a complete architectural project, or from a plane, you can create a human or animal character, or from a cylinder, you could make a product like a glass bottle with all its details. So these are the basic shapes we need to get started, just like a sculptor needs some clay to begin sculpting and then uses different tools to shape it. It's the same with lines. We have different types of lines and we can draw freehand lines, which I'll explain in more detail in the next sections, and then turn them into volumes and finally edit them to become the object we have in mind. It's the same with lights. There are different types and categories of lights and various cameras. Here you can search for anything you want. For example, if I search for box or any other option that includes box, or if I search for light, you'll see all the light options appear here for me to choose from. This search feature was recently added to 3ds Max. It wasn't available in older versions. Now, let's move on to creating objects. The points I'm about to tell you apply to creating any object. It doesn't matter which category, light, camera, or anything else. You select your object, click and drag in the viewport and create the object. It's that simple. For example, if I want to make a cylinder, I can easily create one. If you press Alt plus W, you'll get 4 viewports. Like me, you can use the top viewport. The names of the viewports are written here in this section. Any object I select, I can create it from any viewport I want. Now, there's a very important point about the objects we create, which I'll explain now. When objects are created in the perspective or top viewport, there's a difference compared to other viewports. Whatever object you create, it doesn't matter what it is, at first it gives you some parameters here. But let me tell you right now, don't worry about these parameters. If you want to edit your object, go to the Modify tab. Get used to going to the Modify tab, and from there you can change the parameters, set any value you want, and adjust its options. Here we have something called segments. If we increase the segments, I'm pressing the F4 key, but note that on some laptops you need to press Fn plus F4. Now these options in this section actually change. You need to activate the Edge Faces option. By default, we're here, but if you set it to Edge Faces, it activates and shows us a grid on our object. With these options, we can increase or decrease the grid and change it, which is very necessary in the modeling process. Of course, there are other ways to change the segments. It doesn't have to be just from here. Just know that we need these grids during the modeling process. And by pressing F4, you can see them in the perspective viewport. If you press F3, it shows as a wireframe, meaning you can also see the segments on the back. F3 and F4 are very important shortcuts. Any object you create gives you a set of options. I don't want you to get bogged down with these options. They're not complicated or difficult. You can easily test them yourself. Each parameter is clear. It changes the radius of the cylinder, its height, or the segments in length, width, and height. It's the same for all objects. Just a few notes about this section. These fields where we enter numbers and the 2 up and down arrows, we call these spinners. There are a few points about them. First, I can select the field and type in the number I want. For example, set it to 30 and press enter, or enter 25 and press enter. With the tab key, you can move to the next field. By clicking the spinner up or down, it increases or decreases the value slowly and of course not very precisely. It's the same for height and other parameters. If you right click on the spinner, it sets it to the lowest possible value, basically resetting the parameter. For example, for radius, it sets it to 0, so the object disappears because the value is too low. For sides, it sets it to 3 since it can't go lower than that. So by right-clicking the spinner, you can reset it to the minimum value. This applies to all objects and all fields. Test the objects one by one and check them out. For example, here we have Text Plus for writing text, and you can see its parameters. After creating the object, I go to Modify to adjust the parameters. It's similar to a Word software environment, very simple. You don't need to get into too much detail. For example, here we can write any word we want, change its font, set it to regular or bold, change its size, and adjust the spacing between letters. If you have multiple lines, you can change the spacing between letters and the line spacing here. Among the other options, we have the extrude option, which gives the text volume, and if you apply bevel here, the edges become beveled. You can give it different shapes, and as you work with its parameters, you'll get a better understanding. This is very helpful for writing text. After that, check out the extended primitives, which are somewhat more complex objects. They have more options and more complex shapes, and actually, they are considered more professional. You can use them as well. You can modify them with different parameters that are available to you and check them out. For example, we have the capsule option, which looks like a cylinder. Among its parameters, we can, for instance, change its segments, its height segments, its height and its radius like this. You can check out the rest of the options yourself. There are also some other objects, for example, let's say a window. You can select those as well, and it will create a window for you. Again, in its parameters, you can change the length, width, height, and various other values. You can easily change the frame size, and with the convenient open option, this particular window can be opened or closed. There are many other objects like this as well. Do take a moment to check out the doors too. But, well, some of them need explanation, which will be explained to you in due time. Okay, let's move on to the next section, the shape section, where again we have different categories. For now, we are working with these splines. If you create any of these splines, whether it's a rectangle, a circle, it doesn't matter. When you go to modify, you'll see they each have their own specific parameters. For example, you can change the radius here, or I can change the length and width, or make the corners smoother. It gives us a set of parameters, and later we can turn these into volumes. Let me show you all of this now. If we apply the extrude modifier, we can give it volume. If you look closely, a new option called extrude will be added here. If I go back to the rectangle, I have access to the rectangle's parameters. If I go to extrude, I have access to the extrude parameters and can change them again, like increasing or decreasing the segments or changing the height. One thing you need to pay attention to here. For example, if I create another rectangle, go to modify, change its parameters, apply extrude, change the extrude parameters, and press F4 so I can see the segments. Because for proper modeling, it's essential to see the segments. For example, I've just created such an object. If I add another modifier, like the chamfer modifier, and apply it, chamfer itself has a lot of parameters, and you can see these modifiers are added one by one on top of each other in this modifier stack section, and they work in order. First we had a line, then the line got height, then it turned into a volume, then chamfer softened the edges, and so on. We can assign different modifiers in this way. This is also an important point that I wanted to mention here. Let's continue with my discussion. I make it an object of life